My name is Mateusz Fałkowski. I'm deputy head of the Pilecki-Institut here in Berlin, and I'm very happy to see you all here. And I have to say, this event, this conference was born from the conversation with Jan Berenc and Semyon. Semyon is not here, but he was. But I think, yes. So, but I think I give you now the floor to Jan. Jan, please.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, actually, we've been working together for a longer period of time, and we both have the interest in the war in Ukraine and supporting Ukraine, but also in documenting the war crimes. And we have the workshop the next 2 days at ZZF together with the Concord project of Zeus, funded by the German Ministry of Research. But we're very happy today in Pilecki to introduce some of the sources that we work with about this war, because one of the special things I think about this war is that the war, as it's still going on, unfortunately, is at the same time documented. And I was just at a conference in New York where people told me it's probably already the most documented war in history. We have a lot of testimonies, we have videos, we have photographs, and you collected also the testimonies and all. And some of these different initiatives we are going to present today. And some of these sources we're going to put into the papers that will be presented and then later on published, so that we can see that even for historians, as the war is happening, or for political scientists, sociologists, we can start trying to make sense of it, and then we can start documenting it, but we can also start interpreting it. And not only creating the archival collections, but also start using them in order to educate the public in Europe and indeed around the world about this war. And one of the and of course, one of the challenges is also to interpret, what are the problems, what are the limits of this sort of documentation, how can we responsibly use these sources, create these sources, and all of this is what this workshop is going to be about. And I think today is just going to be a first introduction, but obviously this work will continue. It will go on, and I think it's very important that it's an international work. It's not only the Ukrainians, but of course primarily the Ukrainians. But we have people working on it from Poland, from Germany, from the United States, from Israel. And that's what makes it special, I think, that it is a very international effort, and everybody, can have their part in it. And in the end, of course, it's about supporting Ukraine, but it's also about presenting interesting and awakening scholarship about the conflict and about its origins, about the war crimes, about historicizing it, putting it into a perspective within the other conflicts in the post-Soviet realm, interpreting Russian military violence in historical but also sociological perspective. So there are lots of challenges. And to start with, of course, we need to reflect on our collections, on the projects that are going on, and this is what's going to be presented tonight, and then the next 2 days in Potsdam with the help of all these institutes, and of course funded by the German Federal Ministry of Research, largely. And Semyon also is part of the effort at Hebrew University at the Nevzlin Center. That's why the Nevzlin Center is also somewhere. Mm-hmm. And you can also say a couple of words, Semyon.
Okay, good evening. It's an honor for me to be here. When we ask for funding for a project of documentation of oral history and documentation of Jews from Ukraine arrived to Israel after the beginning of war, we asked why we should do it now. Why you as academicians, historians, why not to do it in when the time will allow you, and from some distance, maybe it might be more objective, more academically correct, etc., etc. So our answer was, after the Holocaust, the first thing that Jews in Poland established was a commission of collecting the evidence from the victims, because the fresh evidence are more valuable. And we wanted to do the same. in our small position and very small proportion. And we were lucky to receive the funds, and we're lucky to be part of this big project of documentation.
So many thanks, Simeon. And I think this section today, so about this documentation projects, will be a good start for the workshop. And the first presentation will be delivered by Natalia Otrishchenko from Center for Urban History, and under the title Documentation from Within, Emergency Archiving Projects at the Center for Urban History. Please come in.
Presentation. Do you have a clicker or something like this? Oh, here it is. Good. Oh, well, thank you all for coming, for joining this event tonight. And I will start precisely with the idea that was just raised by Simeon, the idea of a distance. What kind of distance do we need in order to start comprehensively assess the reality around us? And in history, usually relying on chronological distance is something omnipresent. We usually do not question this kind of relation between us as observers and the events that we are trying to observe and understand. But I am a sociologist. I always see people in their constant present. And it's something which is inherent in my social studies thinking. And therefore, for me, the question, easier to start, is rather irrelevant. The more relevant is the question, how can we do this type of work in the most ethical and methodologically correct way? So I will speak about a few of the projects that we launched at the Center for Urban History within the event, which might have a historical significance. The event of the rupture in our everyday lives. And I hope it works like this. Yes, perfect. So those projects were launched as reaction to this unprecedented changes that we as scholars with certain type of sensitivities that we gain as part of our education and professional work have in reaction to the events around us. So I can clearly remember one of the days in early December 2013, when we were sitting in the kitchen at the Center for Urban History and discussing the events that are going on the streets of many, many cities, the events which were named Euromaidan and later the Revolution of Dignity. And one of the big questions for us was, how can we, as scholars, as people with sensitivities into humanities, react to the situation, also with our professional skills and tools that we have? And therefore, back then, we launched the project Voices of Resistance and Hope. Another example which is not so far from us and something that you might also remember, the beginning of pandemic, which many of us see as something that will last only for 2 or 3 weeks. Something quite similar type of temporal expectation that many people have about the full-scale Russian invasion into Ukraine, that it couldn't last for a long time. And something which cannot have a very clear end for us. So pandemic was another situation of a rupture, which caused us to think about the ways of documenting it. And finally, based on these two types of experience, we launched a number of projects aiming to document various types of sources that we can have around the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine. So let me start briefly with this Euromaidan project. We started it, as I mentioned, sitting in the kitchen and discussing possible ways of having the documentation project in December 2013. And it was really ad hoc reaction. We decided that we can go to the streets with our dictaphones and ask people very simple questions about their motivations, their expectations, their visions of the future. And, well, it was a type of reaction without proper documents. So you cannot imagine signing informed consent on the street. Therefore, we decided that we will have only oral consent read to the recorder. And it led to multiple consequences about the ways how we can deal with this material. If you do not have a proper signed document for social science, your possibilities are quite limited. And we learned based on this experience for our further projects, namely the projects related to the full-scale Russian aggression. So we recorded those interviews on the streets of Kyiv, Lviv, Kharkiv, and also partially in Poland, in Warsaw and Lublin. And after the protest escalated, after so-called dictatorship laws launched by Ukrainian parliament unlegally on the 16th of January 2014, and after first deaths of protesters on the streets of Kyiv, we understood that protest gained another phase, and therefore we have to start another wave of documentation. And in February 2014, we continue with updated questionnaire, with more elaborated methodology. We also did some mental mapping with protesters even, which are part of this collection. And therefore, we collected over 100 interviews for this ad hoc project of documentation from within. But as I mentioned, we had only oral consents. So what can we do with these materials? How can we disclose this rich data from within the protest, which shows you the evolvement of event, but when you do not have proper documentation behind? And therefore, we decided that we need scholars who can work with this data, organize it into a certain way, and it is organized around 17 categories, more than 700 pages, which are also in Ukrainian or Russian, depending on the language of the interview, but last year we also translated this material into English. And now, after registration on the center's webpage, they are available for wider audience, also for educational purposes. It is not precisely the data that a scholar might need, because it's already a ready-made. It is organized in a certain way, but at the same time, it gives you a very insightful ideas about the way how the protest develops and what does it mean to be a protester inside the protest when the end of this protest is not clear. Because as we know from the narrative studies, the end of the event often gives the meaning of the event itself. But when we do not have this end, what kind of assessments can we make and how we can make meaningful connections for the stories? So I encourage you to register on this webpage, Urban Media Archive, Oral Histories, and read this material, which is available also in English. And even more, I encourage you to work with this material with your students, because it is precisely the data which might be helpful for scholars who are teaching conflict, protest, and the region broadly. Another project, and I will speak quite briefly about that because it's not related to the topic of the workshop itself, but it also gives you some insights about the way how we work inside the event when the event is still ongoing. So it was a story competition that we launched in spring 2020 together with our partners from Ukrainian Catholic University, and we encouraged people to share their stories of everydayness with us, and we receive, as you see, more than 200 letters, both emails and handwritten. And imagine it's kind of a very strange experience in the 21st century, reading the handwritten letters telling the story of everydayness, and also responding to the letter handwrittenly. And we organize them similarly as Euromaidan collection. It is based on categories. It is a bit smaller, only 100 pages. And we also have an Archive 404 with the photos that we also crowdsourced for this project. So also after registration, it is available online. So if you are working on, social issues related to pandemic and how society rearranges itself in response to the unprecedented change in everyday life, then I also encourage you to check this collection. It is available in English. So here we are in the situation of a full-scale war, which Russia launched on February 24th in 2022. And with all of this baggage that we have as an institution, the Center for Urban History, which I represent here, a privately funded NGO in Lviv, Ukraine, with this baggage we step in the new reality of unprecedented violence, of highly unpredictable reality around us, and therefore, at some point after the first shock of the full-scale war a little bit calmed down, we started to think how can we meaningfully contribute as scholars to documentation of this new reality around us. And different projects emerged, and I will briefly speak about all of them as a reaction to this full-scale war, which also builds on our expertise in digital humanities, in visual studies, and also in social media, because it is a new reality for us how this war also evolves on social media and how it is communicated on social media. So here is the photos, but as you guess, it is not photos, the set of photos from the full-scale war. Those are photos from Archive 404, from the pandemic archive, and I'm showing them on purpose because the photos that we crowdsourced for our visual documentation project are not available online yet. We have around 27,000 photos already collected from around 30 authors. So it is a very crowdsourced initiative. So photographers and just general audience shared their photos from various locations all around Ukraine about the way how they responded to the full-scale war. Because we have multiple photos of the warfare. But at the same time, war develops also in very different ways, in very different locations. How can we document like the blossom of a tree during the full-scale war? What is your lens focus on when you are inside the war itself? But so far, we are not releasing these materials for multiple reasons. First and foremost, this war is very visual, and we already have many visual materials. Second, we are also thinking about safety of those authors who decided to share these materials with us. And at some point, this material also should be described properly. And as you might imagine, 27,000 is a huge data set. And in order simply to describe all of that, you need a lot of time and resources. So far, this collection is not available, but it's something that we have and something that we are ready to work with. Another huge project with more than 28 terabytes of data that we archived from Telegram. Telegram is a social media which is extremely popular in Ukraine, especially after the full-scale war. According to social research and public opinion polls, around 70% of Ukrainian population somehow rely on it, have this as an information channel. So you can imagine the scope. And my colleagues at the center, Taras Nazaruk and his team, they started this also ad hoc initiative of archiving various Telegram channels. So they archived around 2,700 of different channels and chats with 37 thematic collections, quite diverse. So it ranges channels on refugee life, on border crossing, on life under occupation, official channels, channels of certain locations, certain cities channels, so quite diverse set of topics. So the main criteria for them to decide if archive it or not was first the relevance to the current warfare and also regional diversity. So they really intended to have it quite diverse from all over Ukraine. And similarly to this material that is visual one, this one is not available yet for scholars, also for multiple reasons. First and foremost, you can imagine that there's so much private personal data which is there with passport numbers, with addresses, with so much information which can easily reveal people who are either under occupation now or serving the military or can be threatened in various ways. So first and foremost, we need to develop certain digital software, digital platforms in order to process this huge amount of data in the most ethical way. Also thinking about protection of people whose personal data is there. At the same time, we acknowledge that if we have this huge amount of sources, we have to somehow disclose it also for scholarly purposes. And it's something that we are in between. These different challenges and tensions which constitute this type of work done inside the event itself. And also something which is released already, and I'm happy to tell you that some of the sources are already available, but it is just a tiny part. It is a project which was launched by my colleague Bogdan Shumilovich, who is also a lecturer at Ukrainian Catholic University. And one of the reactions of his team, he and his colleagues, was to launch the project with his students about documentation of their everyday life. And a group of students, namely more than 30 of them, started writing diaries as part of the coping strategy. And they donated these diaries for the collection of the Center for Urban History. So this set is already available after registration. But as you might imagine, the relationship in this case is quite different than in case of documenting the channels on Telegram, when you have hundreds of thousands of people who contributed to this project. And how to make these agreements with them and how to set up rules of using this data, it is quite different scale and scope. But in this case, you can read these diaries if you want to have a glimpse on the everyday reality of this very tiny group of people, namely students of Catholic University from Lviv, which is also far from the front line, but it can give you a set of this emotional reaction and the changes of everyday life that happened with people in spring 2022. And lastly, I will briefly speak about the project which I am responsible of, the project on oral documentation of testimonies of people who were affected by the full-scale war and who are either internally displaced or who left their jobs in order to start volunteering heavily to support those who left their homes and those who joined the army. I will speak more about this project during the workshop, but just a very general overview of the idea itself. So first, it launched both regional and international expertise. So not only scholars from Lviv, but also scholars who are themselves internally displaced, even twice internally displaced, because the war in Ukraine happened back in 2014, and some people already lost their homes back then. Scholars who are from Lviv and scholars who are from various international institutions who have different type of relations to Ukraine. For instance, our Polish partners did extensive field work related to the Second World War and post-war violence in the region. Our colleagues from St. Andrews University did projects on Donbass after 2014 and how the landscape of cultural players also changed there. So they have quite different type of expertise which could be mobilized in order to create a setting of a project documentation which could be respectful to different types of experiences, which would not be, well, exploitative, which will not cause re-traumatization of people who are involved, either storytellers or the team itself, because you might think about vicarious trauma of people who are recording those interviews. And also in 2023, the team launched, extended into Germany. So we now have German partners in Hamburg, in Munich, in Hagen. So it is quite diverse setting of different institutions which recorded the stories of either Ukrainian refugees or internally displaced people related to the changes of their everyday life after the full-scale war. So here are just some of the numbers for you to get the feeling of the collections that we are having and we are creating now. So in Ukraine, during 6 months, we collected more than 150 interviews, mostly in western part of Ukraine, not only in Lviv, because we also traveled around different locations, but also for security reasons, we did not record interviews in Kyiv when Russian troops were still in the region. So the most of the interviews are from Kyiv region, Donetsk region, and Kharkiv region. Women, but also men, so we are quite diverse in terms of gender difference, because in Poland, Luxembourg, and Germany, the majority of interviewees are, of course, Ukrainian women, due to the demographics of this migration. So in Ukraine, we have both women voices and men voices. And where we are now? Now we are stepping in the second round of interviewing. Because the whole idea behind this project was not to have it as one meeting with one person and just recording the story and disappearing. From the very beginning, we signed documents. Well, now it is very important that we have all of the documents signed, all of the informed consents, all of the GDPR forms, because we are in the international setting. Now we have all of these documents in place. And as part of the informed consent, where a person can negotiate the most comfortable level of either anonymization, of pseudonymization, or kind of purposes for which this testimony can be used, also in this form, we had a special place where a person can indicate either he or she is ready to be contacted again in the future. And I'm happy to tell that all of them agreed at that point, which can also tell you something about the dynamic. And now we are stepping into this second round of meeting with the same people with whom we recorded interviews in 2022 and continuing the story. So we are not going to ask the same questions for sure, because even the questions is kind of a very strange thing to say. The conversation was very open-ended. It was rather topic-oriented, not question-oriented. But we are going to continue the story with the same person with whom we ended up a conversation either in spring or in summer 2022, and ask about the developments in their lives. So we want to see it as continuation of the story. And also we are going to speak about the experience of interview itself. Because we have so many discussions in the field, will these interviews have therapeutic effect, or will they cause traumatization? But basically, we can talk with people about this type of experience and see how they reflect on that. Do they even remember the moment of giving testimony? So for us, it is a very important moment when we can come back to the same group of people and continue this conversation, both on ethical ground, but also methodologically. And I would like to ask with this, to end this brief introduction, or maybe not so brief introduction, with some general questions and observations that I have while being in the field. So we have different temporalities, this issue of distance that we start with, the temporality of collection and disclosure. Sometimes we can collect the material quite soon, but does it mean that we have to disclose it immediately? Or do we need to work with it a little bit and think about possible ways of disclosure? And at the same time, we are in the situation when people, especially those who share their testimonies, want to be visible, want to be heard. And therefore, we have to adhere to this challenge. We have to react and think, how can we make these stories visible in various ways? Not only in academic articles, which would be read by, well, a group of peers, which is not a big group, but how can we think about other ways of contributing to another type of historical culture where people are full participants of? How can we work with the issue of trust, especially trust in humanities in the field where the trust in humanities is shrinking? How can we build another type of relations with other societies, also with the mean of these testimonies? Can it be a step forward for us when we can develop better procedures also for a better trust into humanities and social sciences in general? So thank you again, and via this QR code you can check our webpage of the project that I just described, the documentation of oral testimonies. And I encourage you to join us during the next 2 days for the workshop, which I'm sure will be very engaging and will open much more questions that I just arised. Thank you.
Many thanks, Natalia. So I propose we do short opportunity to ask questions after the three presentations, but if you have any specific ad rem question to Natalia, please ask now. So is anybody in need of asking? No. So the second presentation will be given by Anna Kushkova from the Nevzlin Center from Jerusalem. Unfortunately, Anna is not with us, but she will be on Zoom, I hope. Marek, my hopes are...
2 more minutes of talking, because we have a little technical issue.
Okay.
I might have a question for you. Thank you so much for your amazing presentation. Thank you so much, Natalia, for your amazing presentation. I myself am an early career scholar, first year PhD here in Berlin, and I'm also planning to research on the Ukrainian society, namely the human rights defenders that are submitting complaints against Russia. So it's a bit of a different focus. It's not victim-centered, but I'm wondering, while conducting those interviews, were you encountering some manifestations of trauma from the participants, and if yes, how did you manage to mitigate in this kind of setting when you're asking questions and the person might cry, for example, and whether you have engaged in some development of this interview guide and some precautionary principles with like other colleagues from other universities, and yeah, that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important question, and I haven't speak a lot about the methodology itself. I will speak about that tomorrow, more on the way how we designed the initiative itself. But trauma-informed tradition was something that we started from the very beginning. But I have to say that all trauma theory developed in the situation when the event itself is over. While we are inside the situation, which caused quite complicated emotional reactions, I would say that we need to think about extension of the theory, not only beyond trauma, but also thinking about various emotional reactions that people might encounter while they are inside the very, very complicated situation. And as part of our initiative, we had a set of internal seminars with scholars who are working on the issue of trauma and violence and war as part of our internal education of the team. For instance, we invited Ivana Maciek, who did her ethnography in besieged Sarajevo. We invited scholars who work on Rwanda, who work on survivors of torture, who worked on the topics of excavation mass graves, even before Bucha happened. So it's also like how you can envision or not envision some of the developments of the warfare. And therefore, it was also part of our education in a very engaging way. With these scholars, we share some of our questions and concerns, and they also share their experiences and some of the questions which probably will never be answered, some of the tensions which are unresolved. But we decided for ourselves that we are not trauma therapists. We are not medical professionals. We are not in the position to assess others' personal mental state. We had an idea at the very early stage to have a PTSD questionnaire filled before recruiting person for the interview. But we refused, because we are not professionals to interpret this data correctly. We don't want to medicalize our initiative. We don't want to bring this discourse of trauma into the forefront. Because for us, it is important to see human agency even under the very severe life circumstances. We believe in the right of people to tell their stories at the moment when they think it is the right moment. We never pushed anyone into participation, because the recruiting stage was one of the most important for our initiatives. And our internal documents, the guidelines that we developed for the initiative, the recruitment, I think, was the largest part. How we ensure that the person is really well informed to participate. And even I can draw the larger question: how informed is informed consent in the situation of a very open-ended war, when we can have no idea about the way how the situation will develop? Even more, we have no idea how the technology will develop. And I was really astonished by one of the comments by Stephen Naron. I often quote this, his observation, because he's the head of Fortunov Video Archive of Holocaust Testimonies, and he was one of the visitors during our internal seminars. And he said that people who shared their testimonies in late 70s and early 80s, they have no idea about internet and about the way how these testimonies might be used now, about all these augmented realities, all the holograms, all the deep fakes even now. So we have to be really aware of the way how this might be used and misused in the future. But at the same time, does it mean that we shouldn't do it? Or we just have to be really well informed and know about the ways how it might be misused and therefore think in advance to prevent it. So many things arise, but we really tried to do it well informed, to be sure that people are not traumatized, if I might use this word, even though I'm I have questions to the word traumatized here. And if a person cries during interview, well, we do cry during interview not only about the war. It's one of the human reactions, and those who conducted oral history interviews might encounter it quite often. It's just human reactions, and we are human beings. We are, well informed to treat another human being with respect and dignity. And interview is just one of the situations when we can enact these very basic skills of interaction with another person with all of the possible respect.
Many thanks, Natalia. And now we have Anna. Anna will present about her project, Ukrainian Jewish Repatriates in Israel, Jewish Identity in the Context of Russian-Ukrainian War. Please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So you see the title of the project on the screen, and I'll just say a couple words about how it started. So in by late spring, early summer of 2022, many academic centers in Europe were already collecting testimonies of Ukrainian refugees who found shelter in such countries as Poland, Germany, France, and others. But nothing of the sort was done in Israel at the moment. And part of the reason is that there's really no notion of a refugee in the Israeli code, in the Israeli law, or it's not really clear cut. And so all people from Ukraine who are fleeing from Ukraine to Israel, those who had Jewish ancestry, Jewish roots, whether they were Jews themselves or half Jews or grandchildren of Jews or spouses of Jews, they would become Israeli citizens upon coming to Israel. So the term refugee would not be really applicable to them. As a matter of fact, we started this project under the title Jewish Refugees in Israel, but then we changed it to Repatriates. And Repatriates is basically a lame translation of the Hebrew word olim. So those who repatriate to the land of their ancestors, meaning to Israel. Okay, so in our project, we focus on ethnic Jews and their relatives. The two distinctive features of this research is the broader anthropological perspective that we're taking in it. We try to get some deeper understanding of how people individually and as groups reflect upon and interpret the war situation as a whole, which resources they use to cope with multiple afflictions that came their way, and how they're reimagining their lives in the new country, or in other words, in Israel. So this is anthropology, qualitative anthropology, and anthropology of emergency, if you can put it this way. We obviously don't do any participant observation, same as the way Natalia did. So we're not inside the event. We're asking people to reflect upon, and then we reflect upon their reflections. So that's how it goes. The second distinctive feature is the Jewish identity and ways in which it was reshaped by the war and arrival to Israel. So among other things, we strive to uncover how our informal subjects' Jewishness impacts their vision of the whole context of Russian-Ukrainian relations and Ukrainian politics, as well as their political allegiances and humanitarian commitments. We ask whether these people's flight from Ukraine had a Jewish accent, so to speak, to it. In other words, how Jewish ties and networks facilitated the very possibility of their flight or evacuation and settling in a new place. We also attempt, in as much as we can, to describe the anthropological profile of the war-related aliyah, or repatriation to Israel. So in other words, we're applying the Jewish lens and the anthropological lens upon the situation of the war. Now, so how do I switch? Just a second. Okay, so this is our website, Nevzlin Center for Russian East European Jewry. And there's this tab called Projects, and our project, the current project, is number 1, Ukrainian Jewish Repatriates. Now, our questionnaire is huge. It has around 150 questions, and it's divided into 5 major categories. So if you open this website, you will see the short description of the project questionnaire with 5 thematic sections. So again, we try to contextualize the war experience of our subjects, of our interviewees, within a broader background of their lives. And this broad and in-depth approach allows us to focus not only on the traumatic experience, which the war experience, of course, is, but also on the positive aspects of their identity, both Jewish and general civic identity. So there are 5 thematic questions. This is all on page 1 of the project. So we're asking about Jewish traditions and the way informants' families were involved in those before the collapse of the Soviet Union and then already in the independent Ukraine. We pay considerable attention to the political context and the degree to which our informants were involved in social, cultural, and political life of the independent Ukraine, their view of different Ukrainian political leaders, their views on Russian-Ukrainian relations, and all the major political events that happened already in the 21st century Ukraine. Again, the Orange Revolution of 2004, and then all the events of 2014, annexation of Crimea and creation of those pseudo-republics, and then certainly the current war, and specific attention is given to how these political changes impacted the Jewish life in Ukraine. Now, then we move to Jewish immigration from the USSR Ukraine before the war with Russia. And this is important because as of February 23rd, 2022, most of our interviewees were not planning to immigrate. They had visited different countries, they had visited Israel, but they were not planning to move. So this whole image of the immigration and whether it was discussed in their families at some time, in some previous time, is very important for the understanding of their current situation. Then the block on the Russian-Ukrainian war. And this section contains questions on whether the war was expected, their immediate experience, their trajectories of flight or evacuation, the networks they were using in the process of evacuation, changes of their attitude to Russian-Ukrainian leadership, on the propaganda, and other things. This is probably the largest section. And then the final section is life in Israel as a refugee or repatriate. Now, then on the website, you have an option of looking at the full questionnaire. And it has 2 parts, the factual part and the analytic part, but these are very conditional divisions. And then there is the project video teaser. And right now, I want you to look very quickly, not at the whole teaser, but just like 20, 30 seconds of the teaser, how we did it, to give you some feeling of the people we're speaking with. So I'm going to stop sharing this, right? And then I'm going to turn this. Okay, so this is our website, the actual website. in all those parts that I described. These are the 5 categories. Okay, so let's watch a little bit of the teaser, probably the beginning and a little bit in the middle.
I'm afraid we can't hear the sound from the video because you have to allow for the sound to be shared.
Can you hear it?
No.
You can't? So
No.
what do I do to make it?
When you share this, you have to check the point with share sound. I don't know if you see it.
Share sound?
Yeah. Also,
Okay, let me try it again. Okay, let me, how do I do this? Just share sound. Where is that?
you have to exit this.
Okay,
Sharing for now.
let's do it this way. Okay, let me just continue with my presentation, and I encourage everybody to go to this website and look at the teaser, because actually it's worth watching the whole of it. We just don't have enough time. But as you see, we showed on the map where people were coming from, where people were fleeing or evacuating from, and where they ended up in Israel, and the very short excerpts from their interviews. Now, we give our people, our interviewees, full choice which language to speak. And out of 100 interviews that we recorded, 99 people preferred to speak Russian with no problem, although many of them, especially the young generation who were schooled in the independent Ukraine, were fully bilingual. But people, and some older people were bilingual as well, but it was not a problem for them to speak Russian, except for this first woman, whom I showed, and she spoke Ukrainian, and all the others spoke Russian. Now, we have 100 interviews, and some interviews go on for 3-4 hours. My longest interview was 5 hours. And the geography of interviews is Eastern, Northeastern Ukraine, Dnipro, Mariupol, Kharkiv, Izium, Chernihiv, Kramatorsk, Zaporizhia. Central Ukraine, Kiev, Bucha, Irpin, Kremenchuk, Kropivnitsky, southwestern Ukraine, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and northwestern Ukraine, Berdichev. And so here, then on the website, you have gallery of select interview excerpts. And if you click here, you will see 18 items. And usually it's a picture and then the text which describes the picture translated into English. So that's, for instance, a cat's evacuation passport and others. And then there are additional sources, including this project that you might have heard about, Exodus 22, that was launched by the Kievan Jewish community very early in when the war started. I think they started it in April or May of 2022, where they invite people who, as children, were fleeing from the Germans to Russia. And now, being very old people, they're fleeing from, they fled from the Russians to Germany and other countries, which is very impressive type of design and very, very interesting interviews. So here is this website. Yes. Okay, so let me then close this again and reopen my presentation. Gosh, it's interesting. Where is it? Just a second. Okay, I don't see it. Just 1 second. I don't know why it doesn't open. Okay, should open now. Share screen, yes. Okay, so we have, as I said, 100 interviews. We transcribed 94. We're almost there in terms of how much. It's about 3,000 pages, and we are not even thinking of translating them yet because it's too much. Maybe later on. I'm not sure how we're gonna work with the translation part, but 3,000 pages, that's our product of last year. Okay, so I'll say a couple of words about how we work with those materials. So in our interviews, one can tease out a number of what may be called narrative junctures, or particular conceptual and rhetorical clusters, where a number of narrative lines intersect with and enhance each other. Since the project focuses on the Jewish identity, the key question is can one say that the Jewish wartime experience is different from a non-Jewish one? And if that is so, what constitutes this difference? So these narrative junctures are the ones that can help tease out the specific Jewish perspective upon and within the war. And these are some of the questions that relate to those narrative junctures. So we asked people whether Jews were more apprehensive about the possibility of the war. They were more likely to pay attention to rumors, to information shared in social network, official warnings. Whether Jews were more prone to preparing the emergency suitcase, the тревожная вализка, whether they discussed the possibility of leaving the country prior to February 24, etc. And then a very important question: what role did your own or your family's general Jewish experience during the Holocaust played in your perception of the current war? In other words, whether this collective memory of the Holocaust acts together with the present war and how they interact with each other. And we asked whether they discussed topics with others and what were the points of view. Then for some people, and I had several of those, they spent some time under the Russian occupation on the temporarily occupied Russian territories by the Russian army. And so how important was your ethnic origin at the time of the occupation in terms of behavioral strategies, ethnic ties that help survive, and etc. And also, can one say the Jewish networks, whether Ukrainian or international, became more active with the beginning of the war, both on the personal and the institutional level, and describe the role of those networks? So I will now look at one juncture, which was not listed here, to show you how this narrative juncture reveals the Jewish, particularly Jewish experience of the war. And this question, the question referring to this juncture, sounds like this: can one say that Jews felt more or less vulnerable with the beginning of the war as compared to other ethnic groups? For instance, less vulnerable because due to the possibility of immigrating to Israel, or more vulnerable with regard to the collective memory of anti-Semitism, persecutions, World War II, and the Holocaust. And vulnerability is certainly a psychological issue, not anything else. And so responses to this question differ quite considerably, and that depends on how people constitute their Jewish position vis-a-vis a military conflict, individual and family memory of involvement in previous wars, various precedent texts, associations, stereotypes that are invoked in speaking about this topic. Very important, one should certainly not think that what people say to us now that they're already in the safe environment is what they actually felt at the time when it was happening. So as I said, we're working with reflections of reflections. So it's not, it's a mediated type of text. And so as you see on this first slide, some say there was no difference. Everybody felt the same, Jews and non-Jews, when the war started. And some people stress that they were so exhausted and lost that reflection of any kind was not there at the time. And of course, this physical and emotional fragility of civilians in face of war is a very clear phenomenon that really doesn't necessarily involve ethnic origin. But things are a little bit more complicated than that. Some stress that Jews felt stronger than non-Jews precisely because of the collective historical experience of survival. As you see, one person says, ancestral or hereditary strategy of survival. One comes across a fair number of references to Jewish history in the interviews, both recent history, 20th century history, and earlier history. A number of people argued that Jews of the older generation carry over a deeply ingrained fear from the Soviet era, to the point of fear becoming a constant Jewish sensibility, which reemerges when military actions start, thus making Jews more vulnerable. And fear is narratively related to the idea of cowardice, dodging the army, and a number of Soviet anti-Semitic stereotypes about World War II and the Jews, like Jews never fought at the front, Jews were fighting at the Tashkent front, Jews were weaklings, and other anti-Semitic stereotypes. And interestingly enough, one person, and that's the first example on this slide, immediately responding to the question about vulnerability, says, I don't think that most Jews got scared and started looking for all possible ways to flee the country. In other words, he is producing an apologetic reaction with regard to this shared, commonly shared stereotype, Soviet anti-Semitic stereotype. This essentially apologetic reaction is showing how various texts, references, and allusions are evoked in one's perception of the present situation. And off this, I'll say a couple words about the informational environments, or infosphere, which is a key to understanding the position of Jews towards their host regimes. What is important is, in our case, is that the Russian propaganda war against Ukraine, we shouldn't underestimate its efforts. Among other things, it includes unfounded or exaggerated accusations of anti-Semitism and attempts to instrumentalize anti-Semitism and the Jewish question in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And the effects of this propaganda sometimes is pretty visible, and it, Ukrainian citizens, including Jews, were all subject to it to different extent, of course. And for instance, in one of my interviews, a woman says, my friend from Zaporizhia told me about how in Western Ukraine they crucified Jewish babies. Okay. This is clearly a variation of the Russian fake story about the Russian boy on Donbass who was crucified by the Ukrainians. Now, interestingly enough, the woman who came up with this original Donbass story compared the allegedly crucified boy to Jesus. So it's not excluded that the author of this Zaporizhia version, of the Jewish version of the plot, added some religious knowledge to the Russian story, like she knew that Jesus was a Jew crucified by non-Jews, plus Herod was slaughtering Jewish babies, and thus she received this construction of Jewish babies killed by Western Ukrainians. Okay? Might sound preposterous, might sound absurd, but that's how popular imagination, popular creativity basically works. Taking information that's available and constructing it in different, producing different construction out of what is at hand. Anti-Semitism is often seen as an everyday reality in Russia. That's a very common perspective, which I heard from Ukrainian Jews. And there's one example here, the penultimate example about how it's impossible to show any Jewish markers if you walk on a street of Moscow. Anti-Semitism moves together with the Russian army, and Jews who fled from Donbass, those who were twice refugees, right, who were refugees twice, who experienced refugeehood twice in their life, they allegedly were saying that Jews were more at risk when the Russian army came. And then there's another logical mechanism or syllogism that's at work. So Russians are consistently compared to the fascists, and fascists were the ones who killed Jews. Therefore, Jews are more vulnerable in the face of the Russian invasion. So these are just some of the vignettes, some examples of how common people's imagination is working with informational strands that get their way, whether from within the family or from the public sphere, and how people associate different texts and make reference to different texts and create the vision of what's going on, of the conflict. And so what I'm trying to do is precisely this qualitative analysis of the text, trying to tease out these attitudes, general subjectivities, and present a picture of the Russian-Ukrainian war through the Jewish eyes. This is the most important goal of my research. And I can say more things about the ethical side of our interviews. So I'm working in accordance with the American protocol called IRB, Institutional Review Board. And I had to learn it many years ago when I was doing my research at an American university. And it's a lot of different things that you have to observe. One of them is you cannot disclose the name of your informant. Oh, by the way, I think I skipped it because of the technology. So on our website, all those 94 interviews already there, and it explains how you're supposed to quote those texts. Again, you're welcome to use those texts for your teaching, for your research, but there are certain conditions of how to quote them. So people are not disclosed. Public figures are definitely there, and their names are given in full. Recruiting problem that Natalia mentioned is extremely difficult. And for instance, I was going to various public organizations, various cultural organizations, in various language schools here in Israel, trying to establish contact with these people. By far, not everybody agrees to speak. Again, what Natalia said, the trauma, the unprocessed trauma is very important here. Many people just don't want to talk about this. The talking itself is reliving the trauma again. But many other people were open and they would speak. Now, we do not, we created this consent form and I printed them out, but then we decided that we will follow different ways. So we get an oral consent. And then when the transcription is ready, I send this transcription to the people or person. They read through, and if they're not comfortable with whatever they said, I'm obliged to cross it out. So anonymization, stage number one, and then checking with the people whether it's okay to present this to the public. So that's basically how we work. And I should say that I myself did a lot of field research in Ukraine between 2005 and 2014. Tulchin, Bershad, Tomashpol, Yampol, Balta, Mohiliv-Podolsky, and other places. So in a way, these are my informants, like generally speaking, Ukrainian Jews whose culture I studied for many years. And this is like yet another encounter with them under circumstances which I wish never happened. But basically, I continue working with Ukrainian Jewry in this project. And I think I'll just finish here, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
So thank you. Thank you, Anna. Maybe someone wants to ask something, ask a question to Anna. So maybe I just asking one question. So what is your ongoing discovery from this ongoing project? So would you was were most surprised at? So what is something like surprise during this project?
It's a good question. I think, see, when we were doing our field research in Ukraine, we're basically, focusing on Jews per se and the Jewish communities and their Jewish life and the independent Ukraine. We're not really asking any political, quote unquote, questions. I think I was mostly surprised, pleasantly surprised, when I discovered how strong is their Ukrainian civic identity. Of course, it's strengthened by the fact that the country is in plight and the country is at war with a much larger enemy. But these people's Ukrainian identity is very strong. And that's why many of them, although formally they're Israeli citizens holding their Israeli passports in their pockets, so to speak, they say we feel as either refugees or immigrants or tourists. They choose another word. So that's, here you have the disjunct between the formal and the subjective perception, in this case of one's status. And why do you not feel a full Israeli person? Because I'm a Ukrainian. I'm Jewish, but I'm Ukrainian. So the civic Ukrainian identity is extremely strong with different people. And we have people from 19 years old to 102 years old. In this video teaser, you will see a very, very old woman somewhere in the middle whom I interviewed. And she was 99 when she was evacuated from Kiev. And when she came to Israel, she turned 100 years old. And she said, I'm starting my second century in my historical motherland. She wants to go home. She is dreaming about going home to Kiev. She says, I'm Ukrainian. I think that was a very, very important discovery and very surprising, I guess, to some extent, discovery that I made.
So many thanks. Many thanks, Anna. Maybe after the third presentation, there will be opportunity to ask more. We will provide the third our today's presentation. Marek, could you please, możesz nam to właśnie, tak. So I will tell you very shortly about our project we do under an umbrella of the Raphael Lemkin Center, and maybe So maybe I start with some remark that every research project, or especially every documentation project too, is embedded between the past and the future. So we are inspired by something in the past, and we do something for the future. So maybe it sounds a little bit strange, but is it the fact when we are realizing that we are not abstract people going into the territory of abstract land, but we are inspired by our history and by our conviction and our values, and also by inspiration of the previous project in the past. So we are institution devoted to the history of the 20th century, and particularly to the history of the Second World War. And we observed, so we know the examples, for example, of the group of people, of historians and lawyers around Edward Serwański, who started to collect testimonies already in summer 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising, going through the civilians of Warsaw, escaping from the city after the so-called Wola massacre. About 50,000 civilians of Warsaw were murdered within a few days. And the people, the inhabitants of Warsaw, who were really lucky to escape from the city, were interviewed at the very moment, so within few days, by the group of people who, with Edward Serwański and Irena Trawińska, who started to collect these testimonies, and now over 300 testimonies are available in the archive of Poznań. So another example from our past, from our history, is the example of quite known example of the Jewish Historical Institute. So one of the first among, beside of the Weiner Library in London, but this is the Jewish Historical Institute from Warsaw. It's one of the first endeavors to collect testimonies of Holocaust survivors, and this was the history of Emanuel Ringenblum also, and the history of people who started very early to collect accounts of Holocaust survivors to make available proof material useful in what they see as necessary after the war in prosecuting German war criminals. And this is the story of institutionalization of such an initiative. So the Central Jewish Historical Commission was later became the Jewish Historical Institute, the Emanuel Ringenblum Jewish Historical Institute. This is the legacy of Emanuel Ringenblum. Another point of reference, another point of attachment in the history is the power of legal concepts and the legacy of the Raphael Lemkin and his conceptual response to the war and conceptual intellectual response to the war crimes. So he started to think how to grasp with vocabulary of law, how to think about the war crimes, and this power of legal concepts of Rafał Lemkin is also one of this point of reference. Another one is the example of Jerzy Giedroyć and Paris Kultura, and it was Jerzy Giedroyć in exile, following in the steps of Herzen, for example, started the exile journal Kultura in Paris. But what is most important here is that he set an example to how to of perception of imperialism at that time, of the Soviet imperialism, and this example was also very clear and very useful for us. So the Raphael Lemkin mentioned was important to that extent that he started to be a patron of this initiative, and it's maybe not obvious for everyone that he was the man who was, for example, also in the context of Ukraine, he was one of the first lawyers in the world to put forward the thesis that the Great Ukrainian Famine was an example of genocide. And now, if we have this framework of what started our thinking about the project, we can move to the fast forward and to move the potential aims of such documentation projects. So we of course can think about different documentation aims of documentation projects. Some of them were already mentioned by Natalia and Anna, but mostly, more generally speaking, so we can list some main points, main aims of such projects. So first of all, it could be done for advocacy. Second of all, it can be done by the prosecutors and for evidence in court or for future criminal accountability. Third point is, of course, also for us, for ongoing and future research. And on more general level, it's just for future generation, for our collective history, collective memory in future. But if we look at this particular specific aims, we can see that the project which has specific aims has also some specific consequences. And in this vein, the testimonies collected by the state, by the prosecutors, collected for prosecutors, which are then, for many years to come, for many decades, sealed and closed to the public. And it has some consequences. So if you look into the example of the Second World War, we can see that many of the facts we discover many, many years after the war. Even more. So if we look at the history of the war in Yugoslavia and the court trial against Milosevic, we can also see that many facts were hidden, so to say, behind this system of justice. And it has such a consequence for us that we are of the opinion that we, parallelly to the effort by prosecutors, we need also the public effort of institutions, of people, of networks, collecting testimonies and recording of witnesses and victims of crimes specifically for the public, for historians, for journalists, and for all interested people. And from this conclusion, we have some sort of institutional response. So the response was very early. Just within a days after the full-scale invasion, we decided to, as the Pilecki-Institut, decided to start this effort to collect testimonies exactly in a similar manner as Edward Serwański did in Warsaw of 1944. And to this task, we founded the special team of the Raphael Lemkin initiative, of the Raphael Lemkin Center for Documenting Russian Crimes in Ukraine. We started this work parallelly in Poland and in Ukraine. So in Ukraine, we covered much of the front of the regions, partly occupied or sometimes occupied by Russian forces, and we conducted these interviews with these people affected by the war, not necessarily in this very place, but in the specific place of this particular crime was committed. But the idea was that we traveled, so there are two teams of two people. Okay, so I have to use microphone more in good way. And so we have these two teams of composing of two people each, traveling through different places in Ukraine, and this is one part of the story. Another story was just after the full-scale invasion in the camps for Ukrainian refugees in Poland, and we also have some colleagues who travel to these refugee centers, which were as you can see, in many places of Poland. And now, of course, the situation is different. So these refugee centers don't exist anymore. But finally, in total, we collected, on one hand, over 800 written testimonies and over 800 video testimonies. And this second kind of source is, I would say, more useful or more full, showing the experience of these people. And the assumption was that we're really looking for people who were direct victims, or they were witnesses to the crime committed. We have also some ethical rules, so they were already mentioned in the two previous presentation. We anonymize the faces of the respondents, of the witnesses. We don't disclose their place of residence. We don't reveal the identity. And we even, sometimes, even people we are talking to, they want to say open about their names, about their identification. But we really don't want to, assuming that it can have some consequences, and we don't want to hurt these people and their families for the future. This is the fragment, the part of one of the testimonies. Later I will tell some technical details how we do it, but the idea is to produce or to shape the collection of video testimonies with English and Polish subtitles. And these interviews took between half an hour and 3 hours, and they are open interviews with such open questionnaires, starting with the facts about what they do, what they live, and what happened to them and their families just before the full-scale invasion. This is also important in this context that many of these testimonies, many of these people are talking about or talk about their experience before 2022. So they talk about the broader context of the war, which takes already 10 years. So we want to prepare, or we are preparing now, certain specific case studies. I will talk about it tomorrow, using example of the study concerning the sexual violence. But what I want to signalize now are some technical details or some technical challenges we approach. So the one challenge is simply transcription of the interviews. So I mentioned already that testimonies take, in most cases, between half an hour and 3 hours, and they are submitted in Ukrainian or Russian or in some mixture of these two languages in Surgic. And this is also the special problem for the technology we use. So we try to use, we're experimenting just now with using artificial intelligence for initial step of transcription of these interviews. So then later we produced a certain CRT files, making it possible to produce subtitles then so firstly in Ukrainian or in Russian, but then after translation in English or Polish. We are working also on some metadata and some ways of organizing the whole collection. But what I want to say is that we now have just a few testimonies until now with full translation and with full subtitles. We're just experimenting now how to do it more swiftly, more in better way. We organize within this framework of this Lemkin Center. We organize also here in Berlin some conferences as workshop today. This is the picture of the bigger conference, 3 days conference on the first anniversary of the war. About 80 people, also Aliona Bidenko took part in this conference, and also Jarosław Chrycak per Zoom. But and we achieved some sort of international coverage until now. And we think that this kind of mobilization is also important in a manner that we need certain coverage, we need certain interest in order to keep this memory of the war and memory of the victims alive now and also for the future. I think this is something which is really important, looking, as I already mentioned, at the example of the Second World War, when we had experienced a Cold War as a kind of a freezer for memory, and we now are in a situation that we have to discover memory of the victims many decades or many years after the war. And we don't want this to be happen in the case of people of Ukraine. So many thanks. I think maybe Aliona, come so you know. Okay, so Aliona is busy and tired after the New York trip. So maybe someone has some question or maybe question to Natalia or to Anna.
Thank you. I have a question about the methodology for all three of you, because it was a good point to put in also the interviews from the, wait, I mix it always up, the International Court of Justice, no, the other one, in The Hague, there too. I mix it. Yes, thank you, that one. About the interviews of, for example, from the Yugoslav war, because I have colleagues at the University of Utrecht who study their like also testimonies which was used for the for the trial, for example, from Bosnians or also from Serbians, Bosnians mostly. But anyway, about the methodology, I can imagine that you asked a different question than the persecutor. And I wonder if you have experience or if you have also colleagues who maybe used the same interviews as well and like noticed like the output of the information as a historian. Because I mean, as you mentioned, I can imagine that as a historian we ask more questions about the context. For example, Anna about the Jewish experience, and the persecutors are more maybe interested in the moment. This is what I think, but maybe you can comment on that. Thank you.
So many thanks for this question. I think, Anna.
So yes, that's a very good point. Even though I didn't say this, but I think I shared with all the other presenters, even though one of the aims of collecting those interviews, apart from general historical knowledge for the general academic community, apart from this, obviously one of the aims is, for future persecution, to punish those who are guilty of all this. Of course, we're not prosecutors when we're asking, and anthropologists were variously called inquisitors or prosecutors, but all these metaphors are faulty. We do ask different questions, and therefore we do get different answers. How to use this later on, that's a separate question, I would think, but I'm not interrogating my people. As a matter of fact, I hate the word interview as such. I prefer conversation. And instead of informants, I usually say interlocutors or just people without, any further labels. And when you analyze the text, like in my case, I'm an anthropologist. My disciplinary formation is anthropology. So I'm using narrative analysis, as I mentioned. I'm using analysis of linguistic concepts, semiotic analysis. I'm using anthropology of everyday life, anthropology of religion, if it's at place. So I'm using different methods. I'm trying to create an atmosphere. I always bring something to my informants' homes. We're drinking tea, sometimes something else, and we're just talking as if we're like just sharing. They're sharing their memoirs. We're talking as if we're friends, like longtime friends. Ideally, not always it happens so. Now the question of how to use this type of material for more formal procedures, such as prosecution? That's a question I have to think about how to answer. But they do describe things that can go right into the persecution, into the allegation clauses, yes.
Yes, this ties a little bit into the previous question. Do you, at this stage, have any cooperation ongoing with the International Criminal Court or the Ukrainian General Prosecutor's Office? And if so, what kind of collaboration?
No, okay.
Yes? So I will be trying to answer. So we have, for example, so I can say for us, so we have some contacts with prosecutors, for example, with Polish prosecutors who started such a study, and they gave us some advice or some maybe remark or request what they are looking for. And this in this part concerning the written testimony, so written part of this collection is based exactly on this aim. I mean that there's this kind of question and this kind of formulating this question, which could be useful for criminal accountability later on. But as regards this video testimonies, we approach people sometimes in very unsettled and unstable situation, and we just want them. In most cases, they want to be listened to. And they start. So we ask some initial questions related to their lives, to their experience of the full-scale invasion. So the day something happened in their home or hometown or village, and then we ask specifically about what they want to tell us. I mean, that they started to talk about so we know in most cases, we know what kind of crime they experienced before. So, because we find them mostly through certain networks. So we know we have in our team, we have colleagues who started acting as interviewers and as people helping other people in the region of Ato, or in the region on Donbass. So they started long before the full-scale invasion, and they know the context, and this is part of the answer. But then, in the context of the very interview, of the very conversation, is as open as possible. I mean that we just ask people to tell their stories, and they should telling them to tell what is most important, what they want to share with us, what happened, and then when we have this information, okay, so there's this specific person tells us about his or her story. So we can use another or ask additional questions relating to the specific phenomenon of we listening to. Yes, and this is something we have to react. But there is no special questioner to this kind of interview for us. I mean that the beginning is mostly the same. So we ask them, and this is also important, also for the sake of criminal accountability and for using it by the prosecutors later. So we ask them to give us the information about them. How they, what is their names, where they live, where exactly they were on this very day, what they saw, and so on. And then, from this moment, the conversation or this interview or this testimony is just as open as possible. I think that this is something, and I think in many cases, just after that, we can interpret. For example, we can find something about identity, what was mentioned by Anna, but without any asking about identity as such, explicitly. So this is okay. So they say, for example, I feel Ukrainian, so this is, and this is important for me. And that was the reason why we decided to stay, why we decided to leave, and so on and so forth. And this is something, but the question is not our wording, or maybe so that we really want to get to know something about their identity and what is most important for them, but we just, the starting point is the data about them, the fact of the crime they want to describe, to tell about, and then the rest of the conversation, the rest of this testimony is as open as possible.
If I can jump to this discussion. Well, I mentioned that we, from the very beginning, decided that we are not psychotherapists. And we also quite early decided that we are not prosecutors as well. Because many initiatives in Ukraine do record war crimes with Berkeley Protocol, because there is a specific procedure itself to use this material for the court case. But as social scientists and as historians, we also think about justice and crime in a broader sense. For instance, for me, the idea of dispossession, which was developed recently by Katrin Wanner in the book on the full-scale Russian invasion into Ukraine, it grasps this feeling. So the war destroyed the very basic structures of your life. Some people are killed, which is like the highest possible crime, like mass killing that happened. Some people are dispossessed of their housing, their professional lives, their properties, but it also operates on such a various level. You are dispossessed of your identity, of your time sequence. For instance, it was my contribution. I speak about how your temporality is disrupted by the war. The crime of stealing a future, is it a crime which you could be accountable on in the court? Or it's just a much broader sense which should be acknowledged, and we as scholars might make these issues visible as well. So it's also about this multi-layered situation of dispossession and loss that people experience, not only by like exact crimes that happen towards them, but also the crime toward the community. And I think other material and other testimonies, which are quite similar in the methodology, because we do not have like the preset of questions, we have a set of topics, and we share them in advance with people so they can prepare for the conversation and decide on themselves, so they can basically enact their agency in the whole situation of the interview, because war is also about dispossession of agency and choices that you might have. It restricted the level of possibilities for you. Therefore, I believe these initiatives, even though they are not contributing directly to the criminal courts or to tribunals, but they can show us the way how the war is experienced and what does it mean for you to be dispossessed of so many things because your country was invaded. And maybe, hopefully, it also can lead to reshaping the whole architecture of peace that we have in the world, because it looks like that it doesn't work anymore with so many crimes happening all over the world, so many wars are going on. And therefore, maybe we are one step further into this new architecture of peace and security, hopefully.
Sorry. Thanks. This is great and fascinating. As someone who deals quite a bit with memory through their journal history and memory, I'd like to thank you for talking about why you're collecting these testimonies. But these are massive numbers of interviewees, hundreds of interviews in Jerusalem, hundreds of interviews through the Polish initiative, 800 or 400 or 600 interviews in Lviv. To what do you attest or attribute this massive willingness and outpouring of people who are willing to be interviewed at these critical moments in their lives? I mean, thank God I haven't experienced any of these critical moments, but I don't think the first thing I'd want to do is talk to any of you. I'm sure you're great people and wonderful people. But you know, if I'm looking for a house or a job or a new life, you know, why are these people sitting down and talking to you for an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours? I heard about what you might get out of it. I heard a little bit about what Anna and Semyon's project and the Nevzlin Center might get out of it. I heard a little bit just now about what you might get out of Natalia. What are the people interviewing getting out of the act of being interviewed?
Well, maybe to some extent, this is the first idea that just came to my mind. They're reclaiming the agency that they were partly dispossessed of. Many of my informants tell me I'm a refugee because normal repatriates, let's say, they collect their, suitcases, they, do all the necessary formal things, they come normally. I had to flee. I had to leave everything. I just grabbed a purse or something and I left. So they were indeed deprived of agency some to a larger extent, some to a smaller extent, but maybe producing a narrative. Text is a product. Producing this narrative, they're reclaiming agency of what happened to them. Okay, that's my first reaction type of answer. But also for many people, different people that were already in the area of psychology, but some people stop talking when something terrible happens to them, or probably take some more time to start speaking. My generation grew up with older generations, grandfather generations, not speaking about World War II. Indeed, they say that if a person was indeed in the midst of the war, he would not speak about it. Those who blab about the war, they were not real soldiers. So, but some other people need to talk about what happened in order to relieve themselves of what happened. And this is the psychoanalytical, in a way, function of a conversation. Again, not an interview, but a conversation. And I would not say there's a mass willingness. Both of us, me and Natalia, stressed how hard it is to, talk a person into speaking with you. It's not that, they're like lining up. You have to put lots of efforts in order to, organize this interview and, conduct it.
It was precisely one of the questions which motivate me to work analytically with these interviews, and it is precisely the questions that we will include in the second round of interviewing, why people agreed to be interviewed on the first place. But even based on this first round that we have, many people do reflect on that, especially at the end of the conversation, why they agreed. And as Anna mentioned, for a lot of them, it was kind of a validation. Having this story being told, it's kind of validated for himself or herself, but also for the audience outside. And many people agree on this conversation at the very beginning because it was this urgent need to share. And gradually, less and less people are willing to talk. And we can also think about the psychological effects. Why? Why does it happen? Why it was such a wave that people really wanted to describe this experience of rupture? And I can speak about this rupture concept because when you are inside the rupture, you have this need to somehow make sense of it. And interview is kind of a setting where you can make sense of it in the presence of another human being, because we are social creatures and we need others in order to validate ourselves, somehow to make the story happen. And in oral history, Mark Cave says about that. So primarily purpose of oral history is to validate this experience for a larger group. because it's also like not only interviewing to me, but for the audience behind me. So all the time there's people who are giving testimonies, they do not imagine only interviewer. They're doing it for the purpose of the future justice, for a purpose of making this experience visible, because they want to be part of the community as well. And it was especially the case for people who left eastern part of Ukraine, for them to say that it is Ukraine, even though it was under occupation for 8 years, so it's still Ukraine. And there are multiple reasons, but the most interesting for me personally is exactly the one which I briefly mentioned. Some people start to see themselves as historical agents. And it's very interesting change that I observed. So history is something that happened to us. We are not passive observers, so it's about reclaiming the agency, precisely what Anna mentioned. They see themselves as the one who somehow contribute to it, even though they make some decisions, which might be like small decision, but at the same time, it's a historical decision. And one of my interlocutors, she used the metaphor of a textbook. So I'm sharing with you because I want our experience being like told in the textbook, because it's not for nothing that we are suffering now. I want it to be part of the history. And for me, it's a crucial change that happened. Like not small people, but like we are agents and it depends on us. It's about this new like level of relationship that people might have with the community, with the state, with the larger history.
Can I add one more thing? Can I add?
Sure.
So in the Israeli case, I guess there's one more function of interview giving or like sharing information. So we're having a very interesting situation here. After February 24th, there were 2 streams of new repatriates, Olim Hadashim, coming to Israel. And part of them were coming from Ukraine. These are Ukrainian Jews. And the other flow was coming from Russia, Russian Jews who also left, their country, in that case, Russia, after the war started. And some left immediately because they didn't want to share with this regime. Others left when this partial mobilization was announced. Interestingly enough, according to the official data, we have slightly over 16,000 Jews from Ukraine who came over 2 years. And we have 66,000 of Jews who came from Russia, like 4 times more. Now, what happens to them here, they become Israeli citizens, and they're subsumed under the same category, new repatriates, okay? So there's no distinction, not much distinction, except for the express repatriation, which was introduced in the first months of the war for Ukrainian Jews. When they're already here, they're one group, okay? And many Jews from Ukraine don't want to be associated fully with the Russian Jews. And so for them, telling the stories of the flight, of all the atrocities they saw, it's also part of what's called in anthropology the identity of difference. They want to say, we are Jews from Ukraine who were kicked out of our country because Russia invaded. Okay, and there are all kinds of interesting, and this is the final block of a section of questions in our questionnaire, how relations between Jews from Ukraine and Jews from Russia who came after the beginning of the war, after February 24th, how they're structured, how they develop when they're already here. And the fact that they're now Israelis is, more important and subsumes the countries of origin or not. And this is a very interesting part of our interviewing as well. But for at least some Ukrainian Jews, it's very important to establish this identity of difference, which is Ukrainian Jewish identity in Israel.
I think only one ad vocem remark. I think so for your strategy or your type of research question, maybe it would be useful to this strategy mentioned by Natalia, this longitudinal. So the second round of interviews. So because I think time and the very presence in Israel can contribute to some processes within the identity of these people. So I mean,
Absolutely, absolutely, yes, that's absolutely right, yeah.
Hi everyone, thank you for your very, very interesting talks for all the three presenters. I have a question about the relationship between your research and media, because I think kind of two of the three presenters, I think, have mentioned that it's kind of important to make your research more accessible, more interesting for different audiences. That would include, I guess, also building relationships with, let's say, institutionalized media organizations. So my question is basically if you have a media strategy or another or linked question, what kind of experiences you had with media institutions, we are in Germany, for example, by publishing perhaps your research findings or some of the interviews, because you also shared some of the slides with media publications. So basically what media organizations were interested in your research, or maybe none, that would be interesting to hear.
Maybe I would show my colleague Patrick Szostak, who can tell us what's happening in German media landscape as regards this issue.
Yeah, sure. I think that's, first of all, a very vital and important question, because we always talk in media how to make contents more accessible, but that's such a vital topic. So the first thing is that, and that's a little bit of a banal statement, but it's true that the most focused interest was obviously observable in 2022. I remember back then when we had like an Ukrainian witness come and visit us, it would be enough to send out like a short newsletter 2 days before her arrival, and we would have international media outlets from all over the world here. That interest in that strength and intensity is not quite there anymore, but it's still relatively strong. And I think in order to uphold this interest, a number of activities is important. First of all, try to make this is really tough content, right? Let's be honest, like by definition, but try to make it accessible, try to publish excerpts, try to publish the most important conclusions and lessons out of that, while still remaining a very high standard of academic documentation and sources. The second thing is you can also focus on various aspects. Like, for instance, we had like a presentation about sexual crimes in the occupied territory of Ukraine. And sexual crime and colonization and wars, that appears to be a rather standard and to be expected combination of topics. But here it is even more demonic, I would say, because the way that what Russian soldiers are using sexual crimes for is not only the typical war sexual crimes, it actually has a genocidal intent. You can see this in many of the comments and statements that Russian soldiers give. They use rape and sexual crime so that there will be no more Ukrainian children and things like that. So if you go more into specific details, which are sometimes very painful and tough, but they show why that crime and why that war is really a specific war, and why it's important to uphold interest. So I would say that this is some of the strategies that you can use. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I just also wanted to say thanks to everybody for presenting today. It's been really special. And Anna Kushkova talked a little bit about how many Ukrainians or Ukrainian Jewish repatriates, they're ready to have conversations with her in Russian. And despite what you just said in your comment, responding to another question about how Ukrainian repatriates don't want to be associated with Russian repatriates. So this whole idea of the identity of difference. In my personal anecdotal experience here in Berlin, a lot of young Ukrainians who moved here because of the war, they grew up with Russian language as the first language, and now they refuse to speak it under any context. They just completely stopped, and they've been speaking Ukrainian ever since, which is their way of empowering their own Ukrainian civic identity. So my question is in all three of your projects, with all of the many different people you've spoken with over the last couple of years, is there any sense or feeling of how linguistic choice or choice of language affects civic identity? Or has this sort of come into the interviews? Does it create rifts between survivors of this war? Does this get any sort of attention in the field work?
We do not ask specifically about language choices, but as the whole situation of interview is about giving choices to people, therefore they can decide on their own, not only about the participating itself, but also about the language of convenience for them. And we are open to any settings. Therefore, we received interviews in Ukrainian, Russian, Surzik, first Ukrainian, then Russian, first Russian, then Ukrainian. So like quite diverse settings that happen, and it's also very interesting research question might be when and how people switch between the languages, what might be the situation when it's most convenient for them to communicate in either Ukrainian or Russian and vice versa. So they might decide on the language, and it was often, as you mentioned, the conscious choice for people who were Russian-speaking in their everyday life to give a testimony in Ukrainian. And I have one of the interviews when most of the questions came from my interlocutor to me when he asked me precisely, how do you say it in Ukrainian, certain word? And like you have multiple questions like that throughout the whole interview. So therefore they perceive it as exactly given testimony. And therefore for them this language choice was important. But at the same time, people who grew up in Russian-speaking environment, for them it is much more convenient to communicate in Russian, and therefore they might switch into Russian at some point, or might start speaking in Russian also from the very beginning. In Poland, it's also very interesting because in Poland and in Luxembourg and in Germany, we also conducted interviews with the same methodology that the one that we used in Ukraine and developed in Ukraine. And it also depends on people who at the very beginning see it as a testimony, and therefore for them choosing Ukrainian was also a political choice. But I think it needs a further research, especially with the whole collections, to see which choices are made and at what point.
Okay, let me say a couple of things. So the question of the language is huge in our project. First of all, because as I told you, we're interested in different political developments in the independent Ukraine, and that includes lots of language laws under different presidents and how people were discussing them and what people's attitudes were to different laws because they were different. Also very important is that one of the pretexts for aggression, for the Russian aggression, was saving the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, as if they were discriminated against precisely because of the language. So there's a huge juncture here as well, where people often speaking Russian, most cases speaking Russian, speak about how they relate to this fake pretext. But for them, the identity of a Russian-speaking Jewish Ukrainian is not problematic. However, there are two jokes I want to tell you. Joke number one. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So joke number one, two Jewish people who came to Israel, let's say 30 years ago, are sitting on a bench in the street and they're talking Russian to each other because that's their mother tongue. And then one of them says, okay, don't speak so loudly, just, tone it down a little bit. And the second guy says, do you think that Ukrainian refugees will come hear us speak Russian and, do something bad for us? And he says, no. But wherever Russian is spoken as language, the Russian army will come to liberate you. The other joke, a real story, anecdote in the first sense of the word as a real story, a refugee from Ukraine, a Jew, comes to Israel, becomes a citizen, and then he has to go to a doctor. I don't remember which doctor. Let's say a dentist, doesn't matter. He goes to a doctor, and the doctor starts speaking Russian to him. And the guy says in Ukrainian, I don't want to speak Russian. I don't want to speak Russian, only Ukrainian. The doctor says, would you want to speak Yiddish? I'm sorry. Would you want to speak Hebrew? And the guy says, I don't know Hebrew. And the doctor says, well, then I don't know Ukrainian. So you have no choice, basically. So, you know, it's a very interesting, complicated question. And I think it should be looked at differently with refugees to different countries. And I can imagine it's easier to switch from no, I'm imagining things, but here in general in Israel, it's a big question because Hebrew is much harder than any European language for those who never studied it. So, and very often the only choice you have is to speak Russian with medical personnel or somewhere else. So Ukrainian is not much an option, only like between or among people who came. Yeah, but it's a huge question.
I think next jokes we'll be telling tomorrow. So many thanks to all of you. Many thanks to Simeon, to Jan, to Aliona, who really greatly contributed to organization of this workshop. And I'm very happy with this opportunity. I think the discussion was really interesting, and I think the next days and next weeks and months there will be also some opportunities to discuss many of the aspects of our projects. Many thanks, and once again, many thanks.